if you do, if
There
you
you go. So Joel, take over.
Sure, I'm so excited to be here. Just so you know, Ed, I took a graduate level consulting course in 1983 from Dr. June Galasich. And it was a practica course where that's where I learned, started to learn about process consulting. And so that tells you a little bit about my age, but it also was what inspired me when we have a meeting here at Dallas-Fort Worth Network every year to plan what are we going to do for the year. We do that in October, right, Jim?
That's it. Oh, November.
November, and we used consensus discussion, and this topic was one that the group selected. So this is a real opportunity to fulfill on the collective mind, right? In keeping with the very thing I think that you guys are all about. So with that, I don't want to take too much more time except to say we had 3 book discussions. Number of the people who are here were in those conversations. They were very, I would say, they were moving toward level 3, right? Not very transactional at all. In fact, the last time the meeting was so deep that I did not feel like I could release the video to everyone else. Because the conversation got fairly intimate. In fact, I asked, would that be okay? And nobody said, yeah, go ahead and release it. So thank you for creating a context with the book that allows us to go to that level. So with that, I want to start by just asking some initial questions that, how did you get to this point after all of these years? Ed, as you know, I just mentioned June Galasich, her book was on consulting. I think it was a Jossie Bass book. And that was a long time ago. So what happened across your career to get to Humble Inquiry? Let's start there.
Well, first of all, can you hear me all right at this point?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. I do like to start the session this way because I'm a little puzzled myself how I got here. So it's kind of interesting to go back to the beginning and note a few historical facts because I think they all influence where I've ended up. My father was a professor of physics. I grew up in an environment of the university and always knew that I was going to be a professor. There was never any doubt. But it took me a long time to figure out in what. I was flunking physics. That wasn't a very good thing to be flunking. But by the time I was a junior at the University of Chicago, Carl Rogers had emerged and he gave a couple of talks and that intrigued me. So I became a psychologist. That took me to Stanford to get a BA and a master's degree. And I really liked social psychology. And then I realized I needed a PhD. And at that point, serendipitously, I ended up at Harvard, which turned out to be very important, as you'll see, because at that point, they had integrated sociology, clinical psychology, and social psychology and anthropology, all the major social sciences, and the masters in those fields, like Clyde Kluckhohn in anthropology and Sam Stauffer in the newly developing survey, they were all together, and I had the good fortune of learning from all of them. So while I officially became a social psychologist, it was very important for you to know that I really look at this stuff from the point of view of anthropology and sociology almost more than from the point of view of psychology. And as you'll get to know me in this session, one of my critical points is that I think psychology is kind of blowing it. and we need to become more sociological and anthropological. Anyway, I was in the Army, so I had to serve for 4 years to pay back for the Army supporting my PhD program. That took me to the Walter Reed Institute, where I had still more broadening because I learned there about ecology and various fields of psychiatry. And being in the Army, was flown to Korea in 1953 to be part of a team to interview repatriates from the prison camps of the Chinese and North Koreans. So even though I had become an experimental social psychologist and was very clear that I was going to be an experimentalist, my first forced exposure, and a lucky one, was to a clinical sociological problem. What happened to these poor souls who had been imprisoned and allegedly brainwashed for 3-4 years in Chinese POW camps? So my first big work was to sit down and interview people. I pulled them randomly off the trucks as they were coming back into Incheon to get ready to go on board ship to come home. So I started basically a clinical project. And later on, you know, I talked a lot about clinical research being the key to our field. Talk to people who have real problems. And that partly shaped what happened then next, because my goal was to be in a university, and then along comes Douglas McGregor, who was my mentor at already when I was a graduate student. I had met him, and he said in a kind of a casual way, "Why don't you give up this university department stuff and come to work for a real place, namely the School of Industrial Management?" Now, you need to understand in the context of how I came to something like process consultation, that I arrived at Sloan, at that time it was just the School of Industrial Management, with really, really, truly zero knowledge of the private sector, of organizations, and of management, and felt very dependent. So I asked Doug McGregor if I could look at the course that Alex Bavelas, who was Kurt Lewin's favorite PhD student, had been teaching already there. And the next significant event in my growth was Doug McGregor saying, "No way, you know, we hired you, a social psychologist, for you to figure out what these management students need. The last thing in the world McGregor would want you to do is to lean on somebody else's stuff." So that was a tough love way to start, but it was the right way to start because it forced me to think, what does a social psychologist, an experimental social psychologist, bring to this party? So I started there, and then a year later, of course, Doug McGregor did the second thing that shaped me. He said, "Why don't you go experience one of these workshops up at Bethel?" At that time, believe it or not, this would have been 1958. They were 3 weeks long. So I took my wife and 3 kids up to Bethel. We had a nice little house in Bryant Pond.
Just one kid at the time, man.
And what?
Just one kid at the time.
And I fought the T group tooth and nail because I already knew all this group stuff. What was I doing sitting there supposedly to learn about groups, until I realized, and this was a very big realization, that, and is why I think everyone who's in this field must go through a T group. I realized that my academic knowledge was being lived out. by me and the other participants in the T group. And seeing it lived out and seeing how I felt during this process, I think was by far the most important influence on me to become less of an experimentalist, more of a clinician, more of what I later came to be labeled as a spirit of inquiry. Because in the T group, you truly learn that you don't know what is going on and what will be going on. So it forces you into that and then move ahead quickly. Then I learned to be a consultant. And of course, since I already knew all about groups, I would give advice and find people saying that was very helpful, Ed, but nothing ever changed. I got paid for my consulting, but nothing changed until I realized that people didn't want advice. They wanted me there in some weird role to be helpful. And when I had this very significant experience with this very interruptive group in Digital Equipment Corporation, I kept trying to teach them not to interrupt. And that's when they always said, very helpful, but this is how we work. It's the day I went up to the flip chart and started to write down what one was trying to say and was being interrupted. And by turning to the speaker and saying, I didn't get all that, could you tell me the rest of it? Magically, the group stopped and let me do that. And then I think we all woke up that I had not interfered in the content, but I had changed the process. They didn't know how to stop each other. And this simple act of going to the flip chart and saying, let's record some of what you're saying, is when I invented process consultation. And I think it's very important to remember that I had been content seduced and was getting nowhere. But when I really focused on how they're doing and letting them do what they need to do, but teaching them a different how, was the big insight. And I think in a way, that's been the mantra for me ever since, is to not get content seduced in being a helper, but to really focus on what's worrying people, why are they having these problems, and how are they addressing them? And I may not be able to help them with their problems, but I find myself consistently able to help people with how they are communicating, how they are talking to each other, and realizing that it's all about conversations, it's all about relationships. And then I come out here in sort of semi-retirement and discover that Peter is having some very interesting times in his career, and we begin to share some of our insights and some of our interests. And of course, his experience in Silicon Valley are absolutely fascinating to me. And so we're talking more and more and discovering slowly but surely that we have more and more common interests. And out of those common interests came our partnership, and I'll let Peter comment on that.
Yeah, Joel, if it's all right, I'll just give a little bit of the other dots that we can connect in the story, and then Ed, I'll get back to the formation of the Organizational Culture and Leadership Institute, which begat the 4 books. But I just wanted to comment that I went to Stanford in the early 80s thinking that I was going to do psychology. It's the air that I breathed at home. It's the food that I ate for dinner with Ed at the dinner table. And what was interesting to me, and this is only about 5 years after the Stanford prison experiment. So, and Phil Zimbardo was my Psych 1 teacher. So it was a very fertile ground. But I realized at around maybe the same time that Ed was writing the first culture book, the first organizational culture and leadership book, that it wasn't that sort of individual level that was interesting. It was what the group was doing with each other and to each other. So I started getting more interested in social anthropology and ended up majoring in social anthropology. And I think it sort of goes back to that challenge that Clifford Geertz, who was sort of was really hot at the time and became sort of a focal point for me in undergrad anthropology. But he sort of raised this challenge that when he said the trick is to figure out what the devil they think they're up to. And, in that little sentence, there's actually so much going on because it's about what they think, not what you think. It's about what they think they're up to. And then what are they up to? And then you have to sort of figure out, well, I see what they're up to, and I see what they think they're up to. And now I have to try to figure this all out. And that's really what organizational psychology is, in many respects, is really all about. If we just take a sort of structural functionalist approach and do a survey and categorize everything and fit it into a nice sort of model, well, that's one thing, and that might be valid. But you also have to figure out what they think it means. So that emphasis, I think, really became a very important point for me. I started my career actually doing strategy consulting, but I think I was always more interested with sort of what was going on, not what was the strategy problem they were trying to solve. Because a lot of times those aren't the same thing. And then I went into a bunch of different projects or companies in Silicon Valley. I worked at Apple for a while doing new product development. And obviously, Apple's always been very good at that sort of anthropological or ethnographic study as the way they develop products. And then went into mergers and acquisitions later at Sun Microsystems and discovered there that sure, the content of an acquisition of intellectual property or engineering talent is very interesting, but the process of how these groups and these technologies get integrated into a bigger entity is really where success and failure happens. And so all of that just kind of sort of solidified my I think intellectual simpatico with where Ed was. But it wasn't until a few years later that I also realized that in exchanging stories with Ed, we realized that there were some sort of organizational pathologies that we wanted to talk about and write about. And so around 2015, we formed the Organizational Culture and Leadership Institute to do some consulting work together, but also to sort of allow ourselves the time and the space to write some books together. And so there was a 5th edition of the Organizational Culture and Leadership textbook. And then we wrote Humble Leadership together, which really was, in many respects, the kind of the culmination of these comparing notes on issues that we think need some attention. Because I'd seen a lot of amazing stuff in Silicon Valley, but also a lot of pathological stuff that needed some attention. And then that's actually about the time that we met Jeff. In fact, I remember doing a Silicon Valley OD network where we were talking about humble leadership, but we hadn't written it yet. So that, I guess we sort of put our necks out and had to deliver the goods, but so yeah, and here we are with the second edition of Humble Inquiry. I think we realized there were some sort of tweaks we wanted to make, but also wanted to try to get it to a level where it could be, very practical. So we added the exercises at the end as a way to just, we always say to people, as you're getting into that book, if you don't want to read all of the theory at the beginning, just go to the end and do the exercises and kind of see where it hits you. What makes sense? Does any of our description of the way you might react or how you wouldn't react? In fact, the whole idea of content seduction is very strong in those exercises, that it's easy to become seduced by the proximate problem when what's really going on is something deeper. So anyway, that's kind of the through line that got us to this point, and love to hear what your thoughts are.
I want to add one other element that I forgot to mention that links now to Humble Inquiry. And that is that, as some of you may know, I was not born in the US. I came at age 10 and therefore had already had some multicultural experiences. And the first edition of Humble Inquiry was partially motivated by my irritation at seeing how strong the US was as a culture of tell. It seemed to me a major element in the US culture was that telling is good and asking is a sign of weakness. And I think that is a very powerful theme in my thinking, that I'm not afraid to see pathology in any organization, including whole cultures like the US culture. This obsession with, if you know something, tell, and if you don't know, don't admit it. I think more than ever, I feel that what Petr and I are now really seriously pushing is that we can no longer afford to be so committed to being the individual teller, the individual leader who knows everything. We really, really, really have to accept that leadership is a group sport, that it's all about building relationships with each other, and that is a process of inquiring and sharing and building level 2 and level 3 relationships together. I feel very strongly now that originally it was just a motive to expose how the US was such a telling culture. Now I believe it's, for me at least, a powerful value that if it isn't accepted, we're going to be in deeper and deeper trouble.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you both for context, right? Which is a big part of this whole work anyway, right? People don't usually go into context. So the through line here that I think will help others listening, in the earlier process consulting work, the parallel with Humble Inquiry, Ed, as I hear it, was the idea of you're not an expert. That what I think you used to talk about more the medical model, the expertise model versus the process discovery model. So I'm curious how you went from that particular line to Humble Inquiry.
I think it's a little bit looking for what's the common theme in all our work. And even from the beginning, from process consultation, I think I was saying it's really all about the relationship you form with your client. The client won't tell you what's really bothering her unless you build a relationship. And I think I learned to function as a humble inquirer before I noted it as a process in its own right. I got pretty good at being low key, saying, you know, what is worrying you, helping people sort out what was worrying them, not just leaping at the, I want to do a culture survey, can you help me? I would say, why would you want to do that? And so then as I got more self-conscious about how I was effective as a consultant, I really dropped the medical model and the being the doctor and the expert, or being the professional expert and telling people how to solve their problems, was less and less part of my experience. Even if I knew exactly how to run a group, I realized that the group didn't want to be run by my principles. The group had its own life. So more and more, I think in my writing, I dropped the idea that you truly have a choice between being the expert, the doctor, or the process consultant, and realized that with human problems, let's get away from physics and chemistry and biology. We're dealing with human systems. With human systems, being the expert and the doctor doesn't work very well. And the psychiatrists have learned this right away. You know, they gave up being the fancy diagnostician and telling patients what their problems were and what the solution was, and developed more and more of an inquiry model in helping people sort themselves out. So I think the bottom line is with human systems, process consultation and humble inquiry is the only thing that works. I'm willing to say that pretty bluntly.
And Joel, I just want to add something, and that this is pose the question to the group. We made a point in the preface, and I know that sometimes it's not a natural impulse to read a preface. so we were taking a bit of a risk, but we did sort of want to maybe put a little bit of a timestamp of the second edition of Humble Inquiry with the preface by noting that one thing that has happened over the last few years is that we've entered a world where there are completely separate, if not conflicting, fact universes that people operate within. And if you accept that there are completely different fact universes, then all you can conclude, if you're focused on the content, is that I'm wrong and they're right, or they're right and I'm wrong. There's, you know, the facts are sort of separate, and they're maybe irreconcilable. So, yeah. But in order to sort of get through that, you kind of have to figure out what's really going on. You know, what's motivating these different, just completely conflicting belief systems? Because if you're only focused on the content, then there's no forward progress. But if you're focused on sort of what's the situation underlying it, and then without asking some of those open questions, how do you get at where people are really at? I think that's where we wanted to try to place this. And in one point we make the distinction between how we're thinking of humble inquiry and the idea of helpful inquiry, which may be somewhat, you know, of a projection. It may be somewhat prescriptive, because you are trying to kind of lead the witness. But that assumes that you've already kind of drawn yourself into the context. And what we're suggesting is, particularly now, when we've got, two bodies of two fact universes looking at each other and being incredulous that they could believe such a thing. Well, how do we get through that? So that was sort of an important contextualizing what we were trying to do with humble inquiry.
No, it comes across very clear. So did you have a question you wanted to pose to the group around that?
No, it's just, it was a level set because I didn't want to presume that everybody had read the preface.
At the risk of being too academic, I will quote, "In the hyper-partisan and tribal public square, the force with which beliefs are expressed seems to matter even more than the facts and their basis in science." That's a quote that I think captures the point you just made, right? And that what you're saying is, how is that happening? What's happening that's causing that? And with real curiosity, right? Rather than, why are you expressing your views this way?
Right.
And that leads directly from the word curiosity to how we got to the word humble. Because we make a big point that we're not talking about a trait. We're talking about a situational feeling that in a world that is fact challenged, the humility has to be the here and now humility of, I don't really know what the hell is going on right now. And that's a direct line from Geertz's anthropological statement of we need to really find out what the hell they think they're up to, because it's not obvious from our world of reality what they think they're doing and why. And I don't know of any other way to get at that except to learn, no matter how much I may be arrogant and think I know everything, when I actually am in the situation with someone who's using alternate facts, I have no choice but to become here and now humble and try to figure out how to get at what they think they're up to. Now, there is a colleague who is really good at this, and we've learned a lot from him, and that's Edgar Schein. Some of you will be familiar with his work because he has worked in South Africa and in Guatemala in situations where political groups were at war with each other. And one clue that he has provided to, if we find ourselves in a room together with someone with alternate facts, the thing that he has learned can at least begin is to humbly say to the other party, can you tell me in detail how you got to where you are today? And are you willing to listen to my story of how I got to where I am today? Somehow the personal history and the personal telling to each other how we got to our positions is one of the very few ways I know of as a humble inquirer to try to begin to reduce that gap that can arise between people who see the world in very different ways.
There's so much here. One of the roles I have, though, is, as you know, we've spent 3 hours in the book discussion prior to this, and I want to make sure, if it's okay, that I at least cover some of the questions that came out of that discussion. And also, all of you can also ask questions as well. But I think in fairness, I'd like to ask some of those questions. Is that okay?
Okay with us.
Absolutely.
And it directly relates to this because the very first question, actually, Suzette is here, and she asked this question very early on in our discussion, which was, wow, can humble inquiry work anywhere? And specifically talked about power distancing cultures, right? Where there's autocracy and dictatorship, or, maybe not explicitly autocracy, but, where there's the power differential. So the question is, are there some, and it's a little bit elaborate, are there some cultures, national cultures, subcultures, or organizational cultures that not only limit humble inquiry, but prohibit it?
Can I take a crack at that first?
Please.
In the theorizing about this, we have said that it's all about a relationship, and that humble inquiry is the way to build from a transactional relationship into a personal relationship. And why do we need to do that? Because it facilitates more accurate communication. And without better communication, we're not going to solve problems. By implication, that is an answer to the question that I don't believe that the typical transactional relationship that characterizes most of the Western managerial culture, where the boss knows he or she's the boss, the subordinate knows what the job description is and what they're supposed to do, and the hierarchy is built on all the different roles. I genuinely believe that the level one transactional relationship, it may not forbid humble inquiry, but it discourages it. There's nothing in it for the subordinate to try humble inquiry with a boss who's not interested in building a level two personal relationship. A boss who thrives on the professional distance between herself and all her minions of subordinates whom she can now tell what to do. And I think we underestimate how much this has become the way that most traditional organizations operate. They operate transactionally. Now, if you go to even the earlier level -1 relationship, which we define as domination, then in that case, very likely, the guard, the prisoner guard, the boss who runs the sweatshop, may very well not want to hear any kind of inquiry. That boss just tells people what to do, and if they disobey, they're out. There are cases we know where a US company hires entirely immigrants and says, you will either work this 10-hour shift and do exactly what I say, or I'll report you to the immigration authorities. And that is a very real way to shut down humble inquiry, because it says, I don't want to be in a relationship with you. A relationship is a two-way thing. So humble inquiry will only work in situations where the other party will also be willing to engage. And it's perfectly possible that I meet someone, I want to get more personal with them, I humbly inquire about them, and I get a very stiff, arbitrary response. And I now know, well, they want to keep it at the transactional level. That's their right. And so we will not have a level 2 relationship, but I will also know that I won't be able to trust them entirely. because they have defined it as a professionally distant thing where I now have no incentive to tell them what's really on my mind. And they may have no incentive to tell me what's really on their mind. So in that sense, I believe absolutely there are subcultures, and at the national level, I think there are too many subcultures in a nation. But yes, I'm sure that in Nazi Germany, a humble inquirer would have been told, go away or shot or put concentration camp. Some version of that.
I just want to add also the idea that sometimes there's that notion that maintaining the structure or maintaining the hierarchy is the more important goal. You don't want to threaten the hierarchy because that creates some, form of disruption or anarchy. We had a really tough example here, and I think it was 2013 at SFO, the San Francisco International Airport. And I think it was a Asiana jet came in basically too low and crashed and cartwheeled. And luckily I think there were only 3 fatalities, which was kind of amazing. But what was pretty clear was that the navigator, the sort of third in command, so not even seating in the number 1 or number 2 seats, knew that the trajectory was off, given the conditions, and somehow didn't have the, we'll use the modern term psychological safety, to say we're coming in too low, because the hierarchy just didn't establish that communication link. There were other ways to communicate that, but at the time it was too late. And so they came in too low, and it's really amazing that it wasn't much more catastrophic. The video of it is pretty striking. But that seems like one of those cases where it's just that there was something else that was a higher order of importance than the ability for everybody to speak up. And, Ed's done a lot of work in safety where it really does seem like at some level we have to accept that there's a degree where it's more important to say something if you see something. And so without threatening our hierarchy or somehow introducing chaos, can we allow that degree of openness to say something whether it's in the OR or whether it's in the cockpit or whether it's in the nuclear reactor? Do we recognize that there are going to be situations where somebody sees something and they have to be able to say something, or the consequences are suffered? The Deepwater Horizon accident, there were tons of examples where people didn't have the ability to say something, even though they saw something. So anyway.
Oh, no, you in the book, and of course throughout the work that you've been doing over the years, I know that you have been working with what might be called high stakes situations where it really makes sense to prepare people for situations that could, result in loss and tragedy. So the next question comes out of that, and it also comes out of Suzette's question that first, the assumption we're making here is that there are specific contexts in which humble inquiry makes more sense. You've already made that more clear. So the question would be, do you have any training models for how to discern those contexts? And more generally, it seems to me that the ability to discern those contexts is a kind of like a meta skill, if you will, for humble inquiry. And what I love about what you've done in the book is and Ed did it a minute ago, it's a slippery slope from diagnostic inquiry to humble inquiry. It's a slippery slope from helpful inquiry, right, to true humble inquiry. So I'm curious, do you do any training around how to help people distinguish those? And then more generally, just to practice humble inquiry?
I have to talk about that again in the context of the occupational culture of management and the larger Western culture of how we choose to organize, because it seems to me that if we were to start to train people, the very first thing we would have to do is to change the reward system from only considering promotion and money to considering as well relationship building as intrinsic to organizational life. So in a nuclear plant where they know the stakes are high enough, they will build a reward system that if someone brings up a near miss or something that looks unsafe, they are heavily rewarded for that. Not just thanks, but it will lead to promotional possibilities. And if you don't do that, and in most of our organizations, it wouldn't even occur to people in the management culture that mentoring and developing relationships with your direct reports and your team members might be intrinsic to effective organization. The best example is the sales organization, where we're so hooked on individual accountability. And we're seeing more and more organizations saying, we really want sales teams to go out and be a team. And then I will innocently ask, well, how are you going to reward these teams? Well, you know, maybe there'll be 10% of the bonus that will go for group work, but they're all still working against their individual targets. The minute the person says that, they've blown it. If you don't make the teamwork as important as the individual target, there is no incentive in those organizations for people to speak up. So we think psychological safety as a discovery is very important, but you use the word, can you train for it? Not if you don't have your top executives start rewarding it. And there is some evidence, yes, some subgroups can really build teams and make relational stuff as important as financial stuff. But I don't think it's going to go anywhere until we recognize that the deep culture of management is stuck in this idea of the only real rewards are promotion and money. That is a major stumbling block in my view, and we haven't called it out enough. But you know, in an effective organization, I remember there were many parts of Exxon that worked very well. And I remember once visiting a European subsidiary of Esochem Chemical and was surprised that at the board level, their internal board, they were spending 60% of their time on human relations promotional issues. Getting to know every one of their people in terms of their potential for rising in the organization, of looking carefully at the performance appraisal, and really building in the human mentoring element as central to the job of a boss. And this was people at the board level. That message begins to get across then to the CEO and the COO. And if someone asked me what's the first step I would take, is that the CEO has to tell his or her direct reports I'm starting to measure you starting tomorrow on how well you develop your people in the process of them developing their people. This is something McGregor mentioned years ago. He had a CEO who wanted a management development program, and McGregor was going to give him a template how to do that. And what McGregor did was to say, how much of your annual pay is your bonus? It was a big number, maybe 50, 60%. And McGregor said, well, would you consider making that bonus contingent on how well each of your direct reports builds his or her own management development system? And the CEO thought about it, said, yeah, I'd be willing to do that. McGregor said, and you will monitor them quarterly or monthly and say, what are you doing? Tell me about it. They could each go hire a consultant if they wanted to, but what the CEO did was, I'm going to measure you on it. You figure out what to do, and I'm going to talk to you, and you're going to convince me that this is a better program. And within a year or two, they had a fantastic program because the CEO had created a real incentive for the direct reports to work on it, use their own creativity. The CEO became humble in that situation. He said, I don't know what the perfect management development program is. And probably McGregor didn't know either in that organization. But they were able to put that incentive into the next layer, and that group put it into the next layer, and so on down. And you get surprises. I actually had a chance to do that in Digital Equipment Corporation when they were a young engineering organization. And the top product line managers, who were their most creative and brilliant engineers, were beginning to run multi-million-dollar product lines. And Ken Olson said, let's build in some management development for you guys. And so he created a team of these people. I was their consultant. And I said, well, let's list all the things that you need to know better, and then maybe decide which one to start with. And I was blown away by what they picked. They wanted to have a very simple, clear course in accounting, because they realized that was their Achilles heel. They were managing these huge programs and they didn't really know how to look at anything that the accountant brought to them. So they started with accounting and then went to some other subjects, but they were very excited about their management development system because they had invented it.
So it sounds in both those examples that the CEO makes it safe for people and also appeals to their autonomy.
He makes it part of what we loosely call a reward system and the accountability system.
Okay. So that it sounds, going back to the question, there are ways to create conditions that would foster humble inquiry. That if you can't deliver training, let's just say, there are certain antecedent conditions that are going to bring about humble inquiry or make it more likely. Would that be a fair assumption, or is it really more something that could happen more spontaneously?
Well, hopefully people read about it and try experiments. But the other training device is to do it yourself. So when I get involved with a new client, and I think Peter and I are experiencing this right now with a couple of clients, if we are not humble inquirer from the beginning with that client, whatever their problem is, then we're already blowing it, because that client won't understand what's in the book if they're not experiencing it from us asking real dumb questions and really trying to find out what's going on.
Yep.
and being humble ourselves.
So yeah, go ahead, Peter.
Just, I was going to say, but you know, and one of these clients is a technology client. And after, you know, spending 30 years in technology, I'm sort of always drawn to the content. So the fighting off the content seduction is really challenging, particularly for me. And because you really are trying to create that condition where you go in as a completely uninformed blank slate, because they'll get more benefit out of you, you know, as Ed said, asking dumb questions, than trying to ask really smart questions that don't help them as much.
At the beginning, you both made reference to stressing the importance of the current culture. You know, you mentioned the preface to the book, the political polarization, and you know, I'll even bring up the pandemic. You guys have done work with healthcare and large healthcare organizations. Can you speak to how the work that Humble Inquiry promises, if you will, can help with what's happening in terms of healthcare and public health? And anything that you have to comment about that, I think, will be helpful.
Well, I noticed something in the chat that I think will relate to this, that there's some discussion about the Toyota production system. And as some of you, if you work in healthcare, know, lean, the adaptation of the Toyota production system is very popular in a lot of healthcare contexts. And Ed has participated for I think 4+ years now in a lean healthcare conference at Stanford, and the sort of the main event has been Ed and John Shook, who, if you folks know the lean world, John Shook is sort of, you know, he's one of the sort of founding fathers in that area. I think he worked with Deming at MIT and spent a lot of time in Japan, and it's just been, it's interesting to watch people sort of trying to grapple with this tension between the technical system that they're dealing with, and how lean and a lot of the methodologies are so well tuned to fully assessing and diagnosing and analyzing the technical system, and starting to sort of get so comfortable with that technical analysis that it's easier to sort of, like, you know, stay away from the social mess, right? So many times there's all of this social complexity that, well, it's a lot easier when I'm doing my A3 to really focus on the things that I can measure, because the socio side of the problem is much harder to measure. But then, you know, when Ed and John get into these back and forth, you can see everybody in the room sort of recognizing, yeah, that's, you know, it is so often, it is these subtle, you know, social nuances that are at the crux of the issue, not just the eliminating waste and abuse, or whatever that term that gets used. So it's and I think the reason that this is why lean is so important in healthcare is because it is a system that allows you to measure very well and try to capture all of what's going on. But also because so much of healthcare is patient facing. So much of it is that simple inquiring process where you as a clinician, as a doctor, you really have to figure out all of what's going on, not just what the presenting symptoms might be, or what the chart said. You need to figure out all of what's going on. And so I think a lot of the doctors that we've talked to really get this, but they also recognize the tension between focusing on the technical improvement, because that's critical, and not maybe accepting the time that it might take to really improve the social process that's obviously inseparable from the technical improvement.
I'd like to give a couple of examples that strike me. And also in that process, I've discovered that as I get older, I'm willing to be more critical of us as well as them. When I confront someone like John Shook or someone about you're not doing enough in the socio part of the socio-technical system, I will often hear, look, we've got huddles going. We've got all kinds of projects like that. But at the same time, Peter and I have been hired to give a couple of 2-hour lectures to groups that are doing these various improvement projects on group dynamics, on how groups make decisions, on how teams form and the phases that people go through. And now the critical part of me comes in and says, this is another disaster in how our individualistic culture has marginalized our ability to understand and really improve group functioning. It is pathetic that how many senior managers don't know how to run a meeting. And why don't they? Because one, they've never been taught. And why have they never been taught? Because they never valued meetings. It's only in the extreme circumstances where the task, like a SEALs group or the Rangers, or in sports, where the performance of the team essentially hinges on teamwork, then we set about to train people. But in most organizations, they're very dependent on groups. Hospitals are totally dependent, for example, on the group that hands off the patient through the patient's whole history, from the surgery to the ICU, to the ward, to the discharge. Those people are a group. They don't realize that how they manage their communications will make a huge difference to that patient's safety. So they'll say, oh yeah, we've got a handoff problem, right? But they don't see it as a group problem. They see it as better communication, or let's teach the doctors how to use ERIC or one of the many formal systems. I'm very unhappy that group dynamics and group process is not a particularly valued thing in most organizations, except as a kind of a last resort when they have some disasters that resulted because the teamwork was sloppy. And then they say, oh, well, then maybe we better have a teamwork program. It's not in the culture. When we first created the Addison Wesley series of OD, it's not accidental that the books by Bill Dyer and later his son, called Team Building, sold the best. Why did they sell the most? Because that's where everyone saw the biggest problems. And I think the situation of not knowing how to run meetings or groups or teams is as serious today as it ever was. I'd love to hear you tell me that isn't so from your own experience.
Well, you know, here in North Texas, back in the 90s, the University of North Texas had the Center for the Study of Work Teams.
Mm.
And that went away. I think there's been to your point, a drift away from practice and study and development of teams. But I mean, I think it's question begging, but yeah, and I know this may be too far reaching, but I asked about healthcare. And what you're telling me, it doesn't sound like the future is any brighter now. And that's concerning given the pandemic. And that's really where the question comes from, is that, do you see anything that could have shifted here? I mean, there's been a lot of research coming out on how can we do better in the pandemic within the healthcare industry, right? So I'm curious if you've seen any light at the end of the tunnel.
No, my view, and Peter needs to speak for himself, but I'll jump in there. My view is that it's already all been reduced to the technical part. Let's improve our research system. Let's improve our delivery system. Let's improve the system of how we distribute to people who need it. I don't see anybody saying let's improve how the teamwork from research through to delivery is treated as the problem.
I guess I would just say, Joel, I think it might be a little early to tell on the pandemic, because what we experienced here at Stanford with the people at Stanford that we worked with was that they sort of went into crisis mode and hunkered down. And so a lot of what they were doing in improvement projects and things like that were essentially put on hold for, you know, the months between October and April. You know, it just, I think there might be some great stuff that comes out of it. Though, you know, one thing that Ed pointed out early on that was sort of remarkable is that the occupational cultures within medicine allowed information sharing that transcended organizational boundaries in a way that allowed, you know, 3 vaccines to be created in 10 months. And so there's something amazing there. And then I think there's also something sort of amazing in the way we all adapted to working in this context. You know, I was going to joke earlier that is it Pahlavi? Did I get that name right? So, you know, there's this idea floating around that everybody's going to go to hybrid work environments where it's going to be a combination of in office and at home, but the thing that's so funny is that hybrid could not be a more vague term, right? There's infinite variability within hybrid. So, but I think, you know, I guess I sort of come out of it, you know, with 2 shots in the arm, fairly optimistic that there is some institutional learning that people learned about, you know, resiliency, I think. And one of the things that we're often asked, though, is, you know, in this, you know, virtual work environment, how do you develop relationships? you know, to the, you know, we're talking about creating this personal connection that's distinct from a transactional connection. And I guess one initial reaction I had to that was, I actually found that in some respects, the virtual environment makes it easier initially to create that personal connection, because you almost immediately know more about somebody than you would if they showed up in their suit and in their role at work, right? We sort of took the veil off in so many ways, in all of a sudden meeting from our bedrooms and our kitchens and our offices and whatever our setup was at home was good enough. And I didn't catch her name, but there was a dog incident at the very beginning of our session today. And my dog is sitting right here and he hasn't made any noise, but if he did, it would be part of the session. It would be a wonderful thing. So I just, in a way, I think those things are all virtues that we're going to realize we should capture, because in a way one of the things we talk about with humble inquiry is that it isn't just asking, it's also revealing, right? It's revealing something about ourselves. And in many respects, the whole, you know, Zoom and Teams and you know, whatever system you're using created that ability to kind of quickly create a connection that people could comment on. I'll give you a quick example. I'm using the blur function on Zoom right now, but there's a picture on the wall behind me that I'm pointing to. It's blurred out for now, but it's an old sort of commercial art of a pawpaw tree. And a pawpaw tree, I don't know if you have pawpaw in Texas, but I know it's in the deep South, it's a thing. But it came from an antique shop in Maine. So I don't, you know, and I've never seen a pawpaw tree. I have no idea what it is, but I always sort of liked it as a piece of art to put on the wall. But we were working with a client in the South and they all knew what it was. And they were kind of saying to me, hey, Peter, what's with the pawpaw thing? And it just created this amazing bond, this amazing connection that we wouldn't have if we only showed up to meetings at work and plowed right into the agenda. So I think there's going to be some very positive learning about how, you know, how in some weird way this virtual is more humanizing. Obviously it has its limits. We all recognize we're all going to need to get, you know, go on walks with each other and have, you know, different kinds of contemporaneous communication. But I think there's, I don't know, this is a bit of a rant. I've gone down a tangent, but I think there's a lot of positives that we're going to start recognizing.
I'm really excited to hear the optimistic note. And so given that, I think, you know, we still have a lot of questions here, but in the spirit of what you just said, I think it's best for me to open it up for other people to ask questions. And so I'm gonna go ahead and do that. I'm gonna just ask anybody who wants to raise your hand and ask a question. And I'm going to, the sun is coming in. June is here in Texas and the sun sets, bam. So I will let other people share while I close my blind.
Gerald Turner has his hand up. I assume that's intentionally. Go ahead, unmute and ask your question, Gerald.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're breaking up a little bit.
Please,
Can you hear me okay?
please speak slowly because my hearing is not what it used to be.
Okay, are you hearing me okay?
Yes,
Yep.
now I am.
Okay, question I have is related to, I co-authored a paper with a Dr. Mason over at SMU here in Dallas in 2004, and it was entitled, Can a Culture Be Lethal? Organizational Lessons in Organizational Ethics. And the topic was addressing the two major disasters within the National Aerospace Association, NASA. The Challenger disaster, if you will, in '86, in which 7 astronauts perished, and also in 2003.
Columbia.
I'm sorry?
Columbia, right?
Columbia, yeah, with Columbia. But anyway, we saw a breakdown, and that was what Dr. Mason and the team tried to address within anything even close to humble inquiry, which would have been extremely valuable. But, and also there was a lot of power distance issuing, if you will, at that particular incident. But I would like to know your thoughts on environments in which, for example, those were very, very high risk, loss of mission, loss of people, and what you might think, or how you would evaluate or assess what might have been in play, because I'm in the process of writing part 2 or rewriting that particular article. Thank you.
I have a particular view of those two situations. And it goes again to the nature of the culture of the occupational culture of management. Because in both of those situations, we did have people who spoke up, who felt psychologically safe to say to management, in the case of the Challenger, I think it was, that these O-rings are not built for low temperatures. We don't know how risky they are. And because of managerial pressure to meet the schedules and to do what we had been committed to as a nation, to do this and to do it on schedule, it's clear that the message was heard but not paid attention to. That someone decided these engineers, they always operate in zones. They didn't tell us absolutely those O-rings will belt or whatever. So if the engineer isn't 100% sure that we shouldn't do this, we will take the managerial risk. I think that's what really happened. They overrode the engineers who were trying humbly to say, we're not positive, but we think this is risky. And I think the managerial culture would justify that. They say sometimes you have to run those risks. It's the cost of doing business. The same thing happened with Columbia. Several people noticed that there was a possibility that those tiles had been damaged and they should be photographed before to see whether there was enough damage to warrant not sending the thing off, because as it happened, they were damaged and that caused them to burn up. And here again, the managerial decision, some risks are worth running, overrode what we would call an effort to speak up and feeling psychologically safe enough on the part of the engineering people to try for a different. We don't know whether there would have been a possibility of the flight manager sitting down with those engineers and saying, let's talk some more about this. Let's build a better relationship. And tell me, what do you really think, Joe, about this? Are we really putting these people in jeopardy? Should we really scratch this flight? Those are very impossible decisions. But in the hospital environment, I've heard doctors, surgeons say, we do have to do risky things, and sometimes people die, and it's the cost of doing business. This cost of doing business is a scary concept. but it's deeply embedded in a lot of industries, that we create the conditions for humble inquiry, but we don't build the relationship to actually talk openly to each other. We still marginalize the engineer, and how we as OD people can get at this is very difficult, because I think this engineering and managerial culture has survived for 100 years and has a lot of success behind it. So even as Peter and I are arguing, but the tasks of today are different, that culture is obsolete in today's tasks. I don't think that's cutting much ice.
Well, I want to make sure there's room for other questions, but it does bring up issues of whistleblowing and, restraints on that, right? And I know this might seem provocative, but if you really look at the Mueller report, remember the Mueller report, everybody? A lot of what was found there, I don't know, Peter or Ed, if you're willing to comment, was that all of the people surrounding the former president had to keep doing things to make up and compensate for him because they could never bring it up, right? And that was the wonderful thing about that report, was it really revealed how there was no room for any kind of inquiry, and that the various leaders surrounding the leader had to do all this other work to suppress any problems. I mean, it's plain as day in the report, but nobody ever talks about that, right? So, but I think that's an example of another example, if you will, without having to politicize it. It is what it is.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess our quick response would be, because we've been able to take this sort of high road, is that was a leader who was very transactional. And this was sort of one of the costs of that if there wasn't a benefit in sort of being open and trusting to other information, if there wasn't some transactional benefit, it wasn't welcome. I wanted, if I could, to just go back to the NASA example, because in a way I applaud that those two horrific accidents are the focus of study, but the one that has always fascinated me is the one where they lived, the Apollo 13 story, because I wonder if in that, and again, I don't know any of the deep NASA history, but I've seen the movie about 20 times, because I just think it's the way they depict how a team facing this life and death challenge actually figured out what the real issue was, what the real problem to solve was. They argued, and the other thing that had that I think is intrinsic to these is it has cross-organizational dynamics that had to be managed. The Grumman people felt one thing, the NASA people felt another, and then the guys up in Apollo 13 had their own point of view, and somehow all of these things got synced up, and 3 people were saved who should not have been. If the movie's any at all accurate how bad the damage to that vessel was, the fact that they lived is unbelievable. And so I like thinking of that one, because again, I think of like Columbia. What choice did they have? They had to try to come back to Earth. Did they have any choice? So to Ed's point about it's a certain amount of calculated risk. In that case, I think there was an inevitability. Either they were going to live or die. But the Apollo 13 one, they did something right, it seems. Again, based on Ron Howard's retelling of history.
Agree, Peter, if I might.
Sorry to go down that, but it's an important point for me to think, how do we try to dissect these things? It's you know, from the sublime to the ridiculous, but it's a little bit like what Google did with Project Aristotle. They were expecting to find something really, really significant about what some engineering teams did and what others didn't. But in fact, what they found was psychological safety at the core of success, meaning they were all able to really communicate with each other and figure out what was going on. That was powerful to me.
I
Peter,
want
if I may just,
go ahead,
if
Gerald.
I may just add a real quick, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Yeah, real quick as well too. One of the things that were not adequately covered even in the investigations of Challenger is that there was a power distance issue operating there as well, because people were not prepared to step up and tell the President of the United States, President Reagan, that he could not do his State of the Union message that evening, showcasing a class being taught from Krista McAuliffe, the teacher, one of the 7 astronauts that was on the Challenger. And no one was willing to step up and take that additional step, saying, we can't do this.
Right.
Other questions?
Well, let me just make one more comment about the safety thing that Dr. Turner brought up, because I'm just endlessly fascinated by the complexity. The case that really should be studied by everyone is the one of how we shot down the helicopter in the Iraq no-fly zone with the 20 diplomats, where these two fighters flew by those helicopters twice, concluded that they were enemy and shot them down. And in the reconstruction, it was discovered that all the safety systems, the radio contact with those helicopters, had evolved over several years so that the fighters and the helicopters didn't have common frequencies. Consequently, the fighters didn't realize they were friendly. Secondly, that they were required to have an AWAC looking over, and for some reason that AWAC had a new crew, and they had the norm that helicopters are almost impossible to see because they're always darting into these canyons. So the fighters inquired of the AWAC, do you see them? The AWAC said, no, we don't see them. So that was a second clue to the fighters that these were enemies. And then the third system was you had the visual and make sure that the silhouette fits correctly. They flew by twice, and each time the two fighters talked to each other and said they don't look like ours. So they went to extraordinary lengths before they pulled the trigger and shot this helicopter down. And it was later discovered that because there were extra people on that helicopter, they needed extra fuel. They added extra wing tanks, which made the silhouette different from the US ones. So the reason why the fighters in the end didn't correctly identify it is because it was a different silhouette.
Mm.
Now, that was a serious international disaster where 20 diplomats were shot down, and the investigation, you know, in the end, found at least 3 layers of problems that had arisen normally. So this idea of normal drift is, to me, the most important thing in safety, that things drift, frequencies change, silhouettes change, norms change. And probably there were drifts in the NASA cases, and clearly there was a drift in the Gulf from it takes 2 caps to do these drills safely. And somehow it had drifted to someone believing that one cap was enough, and that cap failed. So Practical Drift, the book is Friendly Fire by Snook. Everyone should read that book because it is so informative about how complex things really can get.
And could have Humble Inquiry address that?
Not all at once. I think in each of these areas, if you're building a system with different radio frequencies, do you build a long-range control system? Because the reason the frequency shifted was because the fighters needed a faster system than the helicopters. And so 2 years into the program, they demanded a different system, and somebody gave them a different system without ever thinking about this. And I don't know if Humble Inquiry would have solved that.
You know,
think
Joel, I
It's not a
noticed,
solution so much as a relationship building process.
yeah, Joel, I noticed in the questions that you sent us that there were some comments about the sort of the mindfulness attitude that we were suggesting, and you know, so many of these disaster examples, you know, involve a pace of development and effectively a rushing to solution that didn't really culturally allow for a, you know, we better check with, you know, contractor A or vendor B to get their reaction, to, you know, to find out what's worrying them if we were to do this, something like this. But I think, you know, to Ed's earlier point, culturally, that's that kind of slowing down and saying, you know, let's take a process check here, or let's make sure that we're drawing out of everybody in the room that what their concerns might be. That's very hard to do, and that's part of why we keep writing these books, is to kind of say, you know, are there ways that we can, you know, carve out space to ask those sort of what's really going on questions,
Which requires time, which requires slowing down.
Right. But I mean, you know, at the same time, we have that idea that, you know, you slow, speed. But, you know, sometimes if you do take it slow at the beginning, the ability to accelerate quickly actually is true. You know, the absolute time from end to end may be the same, but what's hard is to be really slow at the beginning. And in fact, we have so many systems that we've designed that suggest the opposite. Be really fast at the beginning, fail fast. And that works for a lot of stuff. It works for software. But, you know, for how groups work together, I'm not sure it does work for groups. Humans may not be as easy to change as software. I think we said that in the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Other questions? There's still some time for questions for Peter or Ed. Just raise your hand. Because we have.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to share that I'm finding it sort of obligatory to share my favorite quote that just always I sort of wake up thinking about every day, which is, it's from an obscure T.S. Eliot play called The Rock, written in 1934. But at one point he says, you know, humans, you know, facing challenge are dreaming of systems so perfect that no one will need to be good. And we do spend so much time trying to perfect these systems, and sort of forget that at some point we still have to figure out how to be good to each other so that we don't screw each other in the process. And, you know, being good to each other has a lot of different forms. Listening is one of them.
I do think it's very important not to look at humble inquiry as a skill tool, but as an attitude, and recognize that that attitude is a cultural phenomenon. And we sometimes are living in a cultural situation or occupationally in a situation where there is no room for anything but transactions or domination. And there is that original question, are there times when you can't do humble inquiry? Absolutely, there are lots of times when you can't. But that doesn't change the validity that if you want to improve problem solving and effectiveness, then you've got to find a way to create this broader permission somehow for people to get into a level 2 relationship. I feel like Sisyphus in all this. I don't think we're there. We write books to try to push a little bit up the mountain, but I believe that we're in a cultural lock around these reward systems, and everything is around money, and everything is around telling and so on. We're fighting some very strong cultural forces.
Well, yeah, and since there are no questions, I'll just say, you know, our work is in workplace mental health and stress, and you know, there's a Jeffrey Pfeffer's book in your neighborhood on dying for a paycheck. So where we see it, the consequences is in terms of mental well-being and mental health, right? That these transactional cultures have a significant impact on employee well-being. And that's really to be honest, that's why I wanted you guys here, because I think, you know, we can talk about the efficiencies that are, you know, I think Peter talked about it, the tension in the healthcare, right? Between the technical part of the socio-technical and you're right. And so I just wanted to say that there are significant, you know, the cost of doing business is the cost of people's mental well-being, right?
And now we have data from a resident in the Children's Hospital at Stanford that there are increasing possible mental health problems as a result of COVID in the kids, and there are not enough psychiatrists or social workers to deal with it. Now, this could become a national problem, that we have devalued the mental side as part of the socio, to the point where the typical resident is not going to maybe choose psychiatry because that's not a high prestige, high money field. And we're going to have a real shortage of mental health workers down the road.
Pete has his hand up.
What?
Jim?
Had a question from Pete Sorensen.
Yeah, I wanted to add just a little bit of flavor, Ed and Peter, to what you're saying. I had the opportunity to work after the Macondo incident in the Gulf of Mexico with Transocean, Seadrill, and BP. And to reinforce kind of what you've said already, there was a serious lack of inquiry on the drilling floor, a lack of curiosity in terms of being able to interpret in a timely fashion the signals that they were getting from the well. And I had the opportunity to talk to a number of people that were on the rig when it blew up. And the results are obviously traumatic. 11 people died, horrendous problems in terms of pollution and a very challenging engineering problem to plug the well. But a lot of what happened came back to people not engaging in constructive inquiry and communication with each other. And what a number of people that were on the rig and that were experts in the drilling process told me was this all could have been avoided.
Thank you for that comment.
And Peter, I think in the chat you mentioned something that really caught my eye about the notion of certainty, and I think it was in the battlefield context. But
Yes.
one of the things that we really like to highlight is the Bob Johansen polarity from the Institute for the Future.
Yes.
Between certainty and clarity, because if your goal as a leader is clarity, you're going to ask more, you're going to inquire more, you're going to try to assimilate more information rather than certainty, which means you don't want disconfirming information. You want things that just sort of allow you to amplify or to magnify your certainty. And I just feel like that notion of striving for clarity over certainty is so powerful.
I would agree with you, and I have great admiration for Bob Johansen's work. And it's interesting. I was involved in a particular incident where it took a lot of courage to speak up. And in the end, I was proven to be right in what I said, but I had to go through actually being threatened with harm by my leaders, and it was a scary situation to be in, and the courage that it took, and maybe stubbornness, and I was real clear about what I had to do, but it was scary. And I that was an extreme example in a life-threatening situation, but it's an extreme example that explains what happens every day in so many people's lives, in so many organizations.
Mm-hmm.
And I worry about the fear that people experience when they feel like they should speak up, and they feel like the fear of doing so.
Right.
We've got a comment by Dave Reason.
Thank you so much. This is great discussion. So my question is, the application of this approach in terms of organizational life cycles, and I put that in the context of, I work for the government, I work for EPA, and I had a detail years ago to go to headquarters in Washington, and I went off to this detail with great expectations, but the bureaucracy was so bad, I knew I couldn't do my talent. I just left. I came back to the region, and I'm doing great work because I'm able to work with the public more. So my question is, do you find this in terms of organizational life cycles, as organizations begin and then they become, prime, and then they start to decline, do you find, when can you use this technique? In the beginning, middle, at the end, or is you focus on a certain phase?
Well, I want to make a quick comment that, in some of these books, we've described the layers of relationship model that we referred to today. And so from that level -1, which is around domination, all the way through to level 3, which is intimacy, or often people are more comfortable with the idea of professional intimacy. One of the things that we sort of observe, though we don't really talk about it in any of the books, is that if you look at the life cycle of an organization, it often is the inverse. It starts with level 3, it's two founders in a garage spending, 18 hours a day together, highly, highly intimate, highly effective teaming, finishing each other's sentences because they spend all their time together. And then they progress through somehow sort of sharing a vision and a purpose and creating, scaling an organization, but that's characterized by level 2. It's still very strong whole person to whole person relationships. And over time, as the organization bureaucratizes, it starts to look more and more like a level 1 transactional, or to the extent that it scales to the point where it can exploit a mass workforce, it even goes all the way to the progressing all the way to the ultimate sort of bureaucracy, which is exploitative and has gone very far away from where it started in the garage. So I guess one of the ways we think about humble inquiry is if you're in a situation in an organization where you're comfortable with working with people in level 2 relationships, and you start to see bad behavior, transactional behavior, bureaucratic behavior, or really kind of zero-sum behavior, then that's the point where you sort of have to ask yourself the process question: what's going on here? Why is this happening? Why are we starting to do this to each other? As if you're in the Toyota production line and you're pulling the chain. You're saying we have to stop the line because something's going wrong. But do we have the courage to step back and ask that process question? What's going on here? Why are we doing this to each other?
I have to say that our time is coming to a quick close, and I'm going to turn it over to Jim and just make a couple of quick comments. I just want to say this has been a great thank you, both of you. I have to say that it's an honor because Ed, your work significantly influenced my career and the work that I do and for forever. So, and having these books come out more recently was like very validating, and to see how well it's doing. Congratulations on the second edition. I think that speaks to Peter's optimism. Maybe people are starting to get the message, right? So I want to turn it over to Jim because I know we have some finishing up to do, but it has been a real pleasure and have everybody who's been on the book club and to get to this point. So Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, well, thank you, Joel. I know, Peter and Ed, you mentioned that you had a hard stop at 45 minutes after the hour, and it's at exactly that time. So we will honor your time commitment and let you depart, which sounds like it needs to be imminent. We did have one person who had one more comment. Michael Egan, if you can make your comment in about 30 seconds.
I'm not an OD guy, I'm a marketing guy. And I just want to ask this simple question. What's the role across disciplines for humble inquiry, particularly in marketing?
Is that a 30-second answer?
I'm not sure.
I think it's a process that is independent of discipline. It's a human process. So I think the problems that different disciplines face may require more or less humble inquiry. But the process, I think, is a human process that we practice when we build friendships with our family. And it's up to you whether at work your marketing problems require, is it enough to be transactional with your direct reports, or would your work go better if you got to know them better?
Thank you.
Thank you. We've had a couple of people ask, can they ask follow-up questions by email? And can we provide you your OCLI email address in our follow-up communications?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
You have my OCLI.
I do.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. So there's the answer to that question. I'm going to be sending out some follow-up information. after this meeting, including the attendee list, so you'll be able to connect with each other. Anybody has any objections to that, let me know. I've also put a link in the chat for feedback. We'd also love to have your feedback on this meeting. And also, I'd like to give Pallavi Ridout a quick few minutes to talk about next month's meeting. She has agreed to lead us next month.
Yay.
Yay. Well, thank you, Ed and Peter, again, for a really great, a brilliant session and giving us so many nuggets of wisdom, but also some stuff to really think about. And speaking of thinking about, in July 8th, I have been very gently volunteered to lead the session. And it's going to be a very practical session. So what we want to talk about is, and I'm going to type this in the chat, actually, I'm sending the chat right now. So what we want to talk about is the realities of what's happening right now. So we are all talking about return to work. And what does that mean? So we want to have a very practical discussion and talk about things such as, do you have experiences or stories of organizations that are embarking on bringing people back? How is it going? We know recently SAP made a really big announcement and that was very well received. So do you have examples like that? Are you a person who is actually in play? Are you personally involved in initiatives where people are being brought back to work? How's that going? What are the challenges that you're seeing people are facing? And also what considerations do you think companies and people need to be making individually and as organizations as we talk about this, this whole new future of work? And as Peter talked about, the hybrid nature of things, what does that even mean? What does that look like? Nobody has a solution, but we all certainly have opinions. So we would love to hear that from you. So if you have thoughts, ideas, you want to participate in the discussion, we do not know what the discussion is going to look like, whether it's a panel, whether we'll have speakers. Since this is so fresh as of this morning, we have all ideas we'll consider. So just please get in touch with me. My LinkedIn link is in the chat. And if you have my email address, you can certainly reach out to me or Jim. We would love to hear from you. Thank you in advance.
And I will include that information in the follow-up email because I think this is what we do in this organization. We put stuff together on the fly. and it's a good skill to have.
Through humble inquiry.
That's right.
So Jim and Joel and everybody, we're gonna log off. But thank you very much. In particular, thanks for doing a book group. That's an honor for us to know that you were going to that level. So we much appreciate it, and thank you for the invitation. Thanks to Jeff, if he's still on, for the connection, and it's been great and thrilling for us, and thanks again to all of you.
Well, thank you both once again on behalf of the organization.
Ditto, Peter, thanks. And say that I especially enjoy talking to groups like this because we are fellow wanderers in this difficult field, and we all need each other.